Okay, good evening, everybody. We can finally get started. Thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you all to the panel on the American presidency. I'm Ramu Nagapan. I'm the director of the Department of Humanities and Education at UC Berkeley Extension, and we are co-presenters of this event with the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service in the Institute for Governmental Studies. The event is also co-sponsored by the Berkeley College Republicans, the Cal Democrats, and the Undergraduate Political Science Association. So we're very lucky to be here. This is, believe it or not, the 30th time we have gathered for this event. Just wanted to mark that moment. We at Extension are really proud to have been part of it for this long. It's really a wonderful annual review of the political climate. And we're once again fortunate to have another really insightful and lively group of panelists whom you'll meet in just a moment. And there'll certainly be no shortage of topics to cover given all the political developments of last year, including the midterm election. Just one program note, in a few moments you will receive an index card, and if you'd like to ask a question of the panelists, please take a card and write your question down, and one of our staff will pick up the card in about 30 minutes, and then we'll address as many of those questions as we can in the time we have. Just another note about our own offerings at Extension. Many of you, I'm sure, are really familiar with what we do and the range of course offerings and public service events. On the back of today's program, you'll find a list of some compelling upcoming events, including one on April 26th I'd just like to draw your attention to. It's a discussion on the future of journalism. I think you'll find it a really engaging complement to tonight's panel discussion. So now a few words of introduction for our moderator tonight, Ethan Rarick. Ethan is the director of the Center on Politics and Publications at the Institute of Governmental Studies. As a journalist, he's covered politics in California and Oregon and the West Coast. He's written for a variety of publications, and he is the author of California Rising, The Life and Times of Pat Brown. And his most recent book is Desperate Passage, The Donner Party's Perilous Journey West. So without further ado, Ethan Rarick.
Thank you, Ramu. And thank you all. That's okay. Thank you all for coming on a rainy night. I'm glad that you all made it. I will add one slight addendum to Ramu's comment on the cards on which you're going to write questions. Remember that brevity is the soul of wit. If you write a mini speech, I won't read it, so you'll just waste the time of writing it. So please keep the questions short and to the point. Okay, but for the first hour or so, we're going to talk among a panel of folks who will have lots of interesting things to say about the Obama presidency, and then we'll move on to questions. Quick introductions of the panel. I know you have programs. To my immediate right is Claudia Anderson. Claudia has been the managing editor of the Weekly Standard since the magazine was founded in 1995. Before that, she was for 13 years the chief editorial writer for Scripps Howard newspapers and also the editorial page editor of the Cincinnati Post. She's edited books for the American Enterprise Institute. She was a fellow at Harvard's Institute of Politics, and she's especially well educated in that she holds a master's degree from Cal. To Claudia's right is Jack Pitney. Jack is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of American Politics at Claremont, McKenna. He's a senior policy fellow with the Pacific Research Institute. Prior to becoming an academic, he worked for several Republican politicians, Alphonse D'Amato, among others, as a congressional fellow. He worked for the House Republican Policy Committee, which was then chaired by a House member named Dick Cheney. Later, during a leave from Claremont, he served as acting director of the research department of the Republican National Committee under the legendary Republican operative Lee Atwater. His books include The Art of Political Warfare and a book on the last presidential election, Epic Journey, the 2008 Elections and American Politics. Next to Jack is Ann O'Leary. Ann is the executive director of the Berkeley Center on Health Economics and Family Security, part of the Berkeley School of Law. She's also a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress. Ann worked in senior positions for both of the Clintons from 1994 to 2000. She held a number of positions in Bill Clinton's administration, including special assistant to the president on the Domestic Policy Council. From 2001 to 2003, she was legislative director for Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. She was later a volunteer policy advisor to the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign and to the Obama-Biden transition team. And since I mentioned that Claudia is an alum, I should also mention that Ann is a graduate of the Berkeley Law School. And then on the far right is Dan Balz. Dan has been a political correspondent for the Washington Post since 1978, has held many positions at the Post, including national editor, political editor, White House correspondent. He appears frequently on television programs such as Washington Week and Meet the Press. In 1999, he received the American Political Science Association Award for political coverage. His latest book, which was co-authored with Haynes Johnson, is like Jack's most recent book on the 2008 election. Dan's book is The Battle for America, 2008, The Story of an Extraordinary Election. Okay, so as always, I will encourage the panelists to sort of just jump in. We like a freewheeling discussion at this event, and I'm sure that all of you will accommodate that. In doing some prep for this, I realized that it was almost exactly a year ago that the president signed his health care bill, a signal achievement of his administration. One might have thought that this might have given him a little political momentum, a major accomplishment so early in the term. Instead, he's had, it seems to me, a fairly tough year. He is a little less popular, according to the polls, than he was a year ago. He suffered a shellacking at the midterm elections by his own account. He was forced to extend the Bush tax cuts even for the wealthiest Americans. He recently backed off the health care, at least in one minor sense, of agreeing to move up the date for the state waivers. Seems to me it's been kind of a tough year. So Dan, I'll throw it to you first and then let other people jump in. But you cover this stuff every day in Washington. What's happened to President Obama in the last year?
Well, he has had a tough year, despite the fact that he got through the biggest piece of domestic legislation since the Great Society. I mean, one of the things that's been curious about the Obama presidency is, in a sense, either the lack of definition or the competing definitions of who Barack Obama is as president. If you talk to people at the White House, their view is that the problems that they have experienced, particularly the political problems in the results of the midterm election, it is almost solely a function of a terrible economy that they inherited and that we're having to deal with, and that unemployment rate was almost 10% at the time of the election, and that created an anxiety and unrest and unhappiness, a sourness on the part of the voters, and that they knew they were doing things that were going to cause the economy they hoped to get better, but not in the short term, and that in the short term it was going to be acts and actions that were going to cause a backlash. I think it's more complicated than that. I think that part of the problem that the president has had is that he undertook a very, very ambitious agenda, not just on the economy, but also with health care, without fully preparing the country for it. And I think that he and the people around him underappreciated the degree to which the amount of money that they were spending, and in a sense the amount of government they were asking people to swallow in that first year and a half was going to cause a problem, and that they did not sell it effectively. When we were doing the book on 2008, we did an interview with President-elect Obama in December of just after he had been elected, and asked the question, do you think your election meant the end of the Reagan era? And by that I meant the end of a long period of conservative ascendance. And he said, no, I don't think that's the case, because he said, I think there are certain things that Reagan did that are deeply ingrained in this country and that are still there. He said, I don't think this is a question of big government or small government. He said, I think it's a question of whether government can be smart and handling the problems that people feel need to be handled. I don't think in the first 2 years he has persuaded people that the approach he has taken is the right approach overall. And I think that in part it's because he has been tentative about some of those decisions he's had to make.
And I noticed when you were nodding when Dan said that he failed to prepare the country for that.
Yeah.
You agree with that?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Dan said, and I would just add to it, one of the things I think is so curious and interesting is that Obama really has shifted the way we think of government, or the way we should think of government, and yet we don't view it differently. And let me give one specific example. In December when you were interviewing him, I had the privilege of being on the Obama transition and really looking at what was happening as the Obama team was preparing for the economic recovery package that they were about to introduce in Congress and then go ahead and pass. And this wasn't something I specifically worked on, but I looked at really carefully, was this idea that there was this deep sense of concern about the rising unemployment rate. And so in that package, there were some major changes that were made to unemployment insurance. And so what you often hear about in the media is the idea that we keep extending unemployment insurance to allow people to have greater time on unemployment insurance. But one thing you may not hear as much about is that we also have included many more people having access to unemployment insurance, because there was a package that provided incentives to states to increase the way that they provided unemployment insurance to part-time workers, the way that they calculated whether or not you were eligible for unemployment insurance. And I use this as an example because I think in some sense it's a way in which Obama could have gone out there and really explained to the country, in times like this is why we have a social safety net in our country. This is why we should support workers who have worked hard and have paid into unemployment insurance that their employers have. And yet he didn't do that. He never really fully explained. I think many people probably in this room don't know that those changes were made. So I think there has been a real failure of kind of communicating a vision of what the government should do in these hard economic times.
Why did he fail to do that? Here was a guy known for his eloquence, his rhetorical eloquence, and yet a failure of communication?
Yeah, I think it was a failure of communication, and I'm, not a communication expert. I think really interestingly, he went out there and said, what we're going to do is we're going to create jobs, and we're going to make sure that the unemployment rate doesn't get much, it'll hover around 8%. We're going to try to get it below 8%. And frankly, we're at 9.5% last month. For the last 2 years, he's never been able to meet that. So he's made some very serious communications errors in terms of going out there and making promises that he really had little control over and couldn't keep. And then he hasn't explained what we do in the backdrop. So I turn to others to ask, what is this communication failure?
Well, I'm curious. Jack, we'll go to Claudia. Do you agree is it a communication failure? Is it a policy failure? Or is it just, as Dan started off by saying, the crummy economy?
One problem, particularly with the healthcare bill, has a lot of moving parts. It is extremely complicated, perhaps not as complicated as the 1993 healthcare proposal, but very, very hard to describe in a tweet. And therefore, developing this comprehensive vision that can be persuasive people is really, really difficult.
Well, and it's not just that you can't describe it in a tweet. It's almost 3,000 pages long. And it creates an extraordinarily complex set of agencies and commissions and boards, and affects a huge portion of the economy. And this is a hard sell to the American people. They, particularly coming off that clobbering of the financial crisis, the sticker shock of the TARP, and then the stimulus, and then the huge budget with far larger deficits than we'd ever seen before. Although there was tremendous emphasis placed on the health care reform, this was supposed to be the linchpin achievement. It was incomprehensible to citizens, and the claim that it would save money was unpersuasive. It was simply not credible.
Right. That sounds to me like you're describing not a failure of communication, but a failure of policy. That there were policies pursued which, in your view, were overreaching or unworkable or unconvincing. I think there's two separate arguments here. One, that there's some communication issue on behalf of a positive agenda. Another, that the agenda was weak or
I think clearly he failed to sell the health bill to the public, because the polls reflect its unpopularity over a long period of months, if maybe more than a year by now. And I think that's a failure of substance, particularly at a time when there was a hunger for I think the Tea Party movement had this this great enthusiasm for the Constitution. The Constitution is a document that any sixth grader can read from beginning to end in an hour or less. And at the opposite extreme of public document would be this bill that none of the legislators had read from beginning to end, that they could not explain, and that the president...
Certainly not the first time Congress has voted on a bill they hadn't read.
No, but it was an instance that really got the public spotlight, because the president had, well, it's not just that Barack Obama saw it as a paramount achievement. It had been the prize item on the liberal left agenda since Harry Truman, if not before. And that the president told us over and over that one of the reasons we had to have it was that it would save money. And this, I don't believe he succeeded in persuading the country.
And do you agree that the money claim was an unpersuasive claim? Should he have not made that claim?
Let me first take one other point, and then I'll come back to that. But one of the points that Claudia is making is that there is this lack of public favoritism towards the bill. And I think one of the things that you actually look at when you dig into these polls is that some people believe that the president actually didn't go far enough in terms of health reform. So it's true that there's a lot of public concern about the bill. Some people feel like you're not going to solve my health problems, and that's why I'm not supporting it. Other people feel like it's, the more traditional concerns about the bill. So I think there's that issue. Then the secondary issue, I would say, before I get to cost, is that one of the things, obviously, that the Congress tried to do and that Obama tried to do is to really make some real hard pieces happen right away. So, for example, we made sure that children with pre-existing conditions would no longer be denied health insurance, and that would become effective pretty immediately after the law passed. Same thing with young people who were aging off of their parents' plans. They would get health care. And so these have begun to happen, and there's now beginning to be a political constituency who are seeing the benefits. But those are pretty small populations of people. Many, many more people are in kind of two other camps, which is that they have employer-based coverage, and they're really getting worried about what's happening, and they have no idea how this is going to impact them. And so they are seeing these kind of gamemanship that's going on with premium increases, and they're not sure what's going to happen with that. And so that is a really big, real issue. And then the other people are the uninsured who remain uninsured and remain unable to access it because, frankly, other than catastrophic care, we're still waiting until 2014 to set that up. So I think that because of the long ramp up, there are these real political issues. In terms of the cost containment, I think that that is an issue, and like the others, it's going to take time. You're not going to be able to contain these costs until you fully implement the bill. So I think that I still believe this is a communications failure. It is really complicated. You need to build a political constituency to support it, and he hasn't done that yet. Do I think it's a policy failure? I don't think it is. I'm very worried about these waivers, and I know we'll talk about those later. I do think there's some concern that we're not going to be able to implement this bill, and that would concern me more. Should he have waited? Would you have told him to wait on health care? No, I think he did the right thing. If you look at the political science research, is that the minute in the first, it's much more probable that you're going to pass a major domestic initiative in the first year of your presidency than if you wait. And I think that if he needed to do this, and he did need to do it, he had to do it immediately. I think the problem, and I'll be curious what Dan and others think, is that he did it at a time in which people were most concerned not about whether they had health care, but whether they had any income. They were losing their jobs. The economy is falling apart. They're seeing their jobs moved overseas, and there's not a clear vision of how we're going to have a jobs economy. And I think that is why it seemed a little tone deaf to them, even though, as Claudia said, we've been ramping up for this for 20 or more years. But I think at the time, in that particular year, it wasn't the number one concern. Jobs and the economy was, and that's why there was some disconnect.
Dan, what do you think about that? Should you wait it?
They clearly believe at this point that it was worth the gamble that they took. And despite the obvious political cost that they've taken in the short term, but they certainly expected that upon passage last year, they were going to get a much more significant boost than they ever got. So they certainly miscalculated the short-term politics of it. I think there are two elements to this. One is, given the state of the economy coming out of the election, should they have said, or should the president have said when he first came into office, my ambition is to provide health care to all Americans, or to make health care accessible and affordable to all Americans. But given the conditions we now face on the economy, the best I can do right now is a down payment on that. And I will pursue a down payment with the hope that we can continue to build on it through my administration. They took the opposite course. The famous Rahm Emanuel line, never let a good crisis go to waste. And but I think what's interesting is, there were any number of people around the president, including Rahm Emanuel and at times David Axelrod, who cautioned, pull back. And it was the president at virtually every turn when that advice came to him who insisted that they were going to continue to go ahead and try to do the whole thing. What they certainly didn't anticipate, and I think which really took the toll, was the amount of time and energy that healthcare absorbed in that first year plus of the administration. I mean, their timetable when they were in the transition was to have that done by shortly after Labor Day. And instead it dragged on and on and on. You know, we can litigate the reasons it did and whether they could or should have done things along the way to prod the process. But it took so long that A, it did take focus off the economy. B, it put a bright light on the sausage making in Congress, which in this particular case got to be pretty ugly at times. And I think that the other problem, it's just a reminder of the political dangers of trying to enact something that big, that large, without some sense of bipartisan agreement on it. Now, you can argue that it was the Republicans who were unwilling to deal, or the White House that was unwilling to deal. We can't resolve that tonight, but there's no question that Obama's willingness to do this strictly with Democratic votes came at a high cost.
Jack, did you want to?
Mostly related to the issue of complexity is uncertainty, because with something this big and complicated, measuring the likely effects is extremely difficult. How much is this going to cost? How many people are going to be affected in what way? There were a lot of numbers thrown around in the debate, and a lot of people just didn't believe them. In part, and you alluded to this before, the initial public relations error of projecting that unemployment would top out at 8%. That was not smart. Also, it was a legacy of years and years of numbers and quote-unquote facts coming from Washington that turned out to be plain wrong. So they had to deal with that. And consequently, the plan was running into some radical skepticism. And even when the Obama administration thought they had a good case, people just didn't believe it.
Is there something, having pursued the health care plan, having achieved that as a significant policy achievement, at least for those people who supported the bill, is there something substantial or significant the president could have done differently in the wake of that would have raised his popularity over the last year, or given the economy, was he destined to lose some popularity over this last year? Because is there something that, Anne, if you'd still been there instead of on the transition team, if you'd been there in the White House, would you have told him to do something differently?
Well, I mean, I think the problem is they used so much political capital on getting the health reform bill done that it was then difficult to kind of figure out how do you then go back to your jobs agenda. So there were many people in Washington on the left side who were calling for a second stimulus bill, saying that, we actually didn't spend enough the first time around when we spent $867 billion on the recovery, that it should have been much larger. And if it had been larger, it would have created more jobs and we could continue. But there was no way you were going to get a second stimulus through the Congress after having just dealt with the health reform bill and used every single political capital, that you had. So I think that it's hard to say what they could have done other than, figure out some magic way of dealing with the economy, because I don't think they shifted quickly enough to assuring the American public that the economy was the top of their agenda and they had a plan. I think, if you ask, my dad is here with me tonight, and I asked him on the way over, do you know what Obama's jobs plan is? And my dad is very politically savvy and reads the paper and follows these things, doesn't know. So he's my point of one reference. But I bet if we polled the room that it would be difficult for people to say what the jobs plan is for the Obama administration. I think that is a real difficulty.
I actually, in researching for this last week, I noticed half of all, in a New York Times poll, sorry, Dan, not a Washington Post poll. I couldn't find this in the Post poll. New York Times poll, half of all voters think that TARP was passed under Obama. Of course, it's not true. So, I mean, that's sort of an ongoing problem that you cannot over-rely on intense knowledge on the part of the voters.
I think by last spring, there was almost nothing they could do. I think I have rarely seen an election that was so clear so far in advance of what was likely to happen. I mean, obviously you can't tell the exact number of House seats that are going to flip, but you could see this wave coming very early. That for a variety of reasons, the country locked in opinions of Obama, and given what had happened in the first year, in 3 or 4 months, it was clear that the right side of the electorate was energized and the left side was demoralized. And I don't think there was, given, as Ann said, there was no more money to spend to try to do anything. They had played all that out. So they were just destined to kind of ride it out and take the shellacking and then begin to pick up the pieces.
Is there something, let me undermine my own first question here and play devil's advocate for a minute. I wonder if, in a different sense, you could look at the first 2 years of the Obama administration and see a much rosier picture. And I'm wondering if there's some validity to that. You could say, here's a guy who signaled domestic policy achievement, slowly improving economy, slowly, not much, but slowly improving economy. His popularity now, I went back and looked at Gallup polls, his popularity is now equal to Bill Clinton's popularity at the corresponding time in the first term. He's more popular than Ronald Reagan at the corresponding time in the first term, both reelected. Are we being too hard on Barack Obama? Are we expecting too much out of him?
There's an interesting poll that you didn't cite, a poll question, and that is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? And about 6 months into the administration, that flipped, and it's now something like 64% are saying wrong direction, and it's been a large gap for a long time. I think it's hard to make the case that it may not look like it, but this is a subtly successful 2 years. No, the election sent an unmistakable message. Obamacare was repealed in the House by a much larger margin than originally had passed it in the Democratic House. It seems to me the case that despite appearances, this has been a success so far is very hard to make. What would be Exhibit A if you were going to make that case?
I'd give a couple. I think it's actually amazing how much has changed in the last 2 years. We were on this path to trying to say that Americans should bear more responsibility and more risk-taking with regard to pensions, with regard to health care. We were having fewer people on unemployment. Students were having a hard time getting loans. The Obama administration has really shifted this. They have a very different vision of government. They haven't been able to articulate it, but we passed a major health reform that we've already talked about. But in addition to that, as I said, we passed this major change in unemployment insurance, opening it up to many more people. As part of the health bill, something you probably didn't read very much about is that we also expanded direct lending to students so they could have more access to college. You probably know also that the Obama administration passed major major consumer protections in terms of the financial industry. So in relation to the mortgage crisis, credit card crises, that we really are going to have a much more robust government role in terms of consumer protection. So it's a really quite a shift in terms of the envisioning of what the government should do to protect ordinary middle-class Americans from economic insecurity. As I say, I don't think that the American public yet know how much has changed. And the problem is that I think it's going to take some years for us to be able to look back and see that these changes did make a big impact in a positive direction. I don't know that we're going to get to that soon, but I think if we look back in 10 years from now, we're going to see that this was a pivotal time in our country.
And I think Jack, maybe you want to get in on that, but I think part of the exhibit would just be that he is in fact more popular than a couple of other recent first-term presidents who were in fact reelected, or as popular as Bill Clinton, more so than Ronald Reagan.
Well, one difficulty, and here's something political scientists don't like to admit, that models really don't work. Period. That is, we're in a period where there are a lot of variables for which we don't have good analogs. Look at the size of the national debt and the likely trend of the national debt. We're way out in the blue. We just don't have anything with which to compare that. And at least in the short run, that is leading to a reaction involving the Tea Party, the movement toward very strict interpretation of the Constitution. We're in an economic era, extended period of very high unemployment. Don't really have good analogs to that. So how this plays out in the future, it's hard to say. More likely than not that the president will win re-election, but I wouldn't necessarily bet my next mortgage payment on that.
Dan, did you want?
I think if you look at President Obama and compare him to both President Reagan and President Clinton, compared to Clinton at this time in Clinton's presidency, he's probably in somewhat better shape in this regard. He's made a faster pivot off of the mat from the election defeat than Bill Clinton did after '94. It took Bill Clinton many months to kind of get his sea legs, and clearly President Obama had a very successful lame duck session, which I think gave him and the White House team some greater confidence to take on the Republicans. If you compare him with Reagan, Reagan had lower numbers and higher unemployment at this point than President Obama has. The difficulty for President Obama is that Reagan was able to have a period of extraordinary economic growth beginning in the middle of 1983 and carrying through the 1984 election. I mean, quarterly growth rates of 7.5%, 8.5%, which is far beyond anything the economists are talking about now, which means the unemployment rate may go down some, but it's probably going to go down more slowly than it did during Reagan. Now, so much of this ultimately becomes public perception. Do people feel that things are going in the right direction or not? Claudia's right. People at this point don't feel that. But if the unemployment rate continues to tick down and the stock market doesn't go into the tank, but perhaps continues to rise some, then people may look at President Obama, particularly given the opposition, and say, we'd rather stick with him than not. I mean, as Jack suggests, it is very difficult to defeat an incumbent president in this country unless, things are extraordinarily bad, and we don't know what they're going to be like in another year. Mm-hmm.
Dan, I'd be interested in your views as to whether, if Obama remains reticent on entitlements, the big driver of the deficits and the debt, is that going to harm him with the electorate, do you think? Or are we going to continue to pretending that looming problem isn't there?
There's some evidence that the public is more attuned to the longer-term problem of Social Security and somewhat more willing to do some of the tough things you would have to do to fix Social Security. But still not, most people aren't there on supporting those. I think there is still probably a greater risk than a clear reward for tackling those. Both sides obviously say they're going to try to get to it this year, but I think we should all be skeptical that they're really serious about that, unless there is a kind of a collective willingness to hold hands and walk off the ledge together. And so far, neither side's shown that they're prepared to do that.
Well, let's talk about the coming year for a second, and what the president does in the coming year. So keep his fingers crossed for economic growth of 7.5% a quarter. But other than that, what's the agenda he pursues? It seems to me the State of the Union offered a sort of ambitious but vague agenda without a lot of detail. Today he mentioned the changes to No Child Left Behind, at least in the initial story I saw. Again, not a whole lot of detail. Is there what does he do for the next year in terms of a domestic agenda?
I think it's curious, actually, which is to say that his State of the Union really focused on education, and he's out there talking about No Child Left Behind, making changes and really showing how committed he is with his very strong Secretary of Education. This is an issue that people care about, but I think many people don't see the federal government as playing the large role in it. What they're seeing is what's happening here in California, which is, kind of hanging on how bad are the cuts going to be from the state budget cuts, which is a much higher percentage of our education budget than what's happening at the federal level. So it's a bit removed, and it's, again, not really about economic security that families are facing. So I think it's a curious move that they're making to focus as much as they have been on education.
Well, it's a bit like Clinton after
school uniforms.
Well, yeah, when there's not money to spend, you have to find things to do that don't cost a lot of money, and he has found some. He moved on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and this move on the Defense of Marriage Act. Those were free, as it were, and I suspect he'll look for other such steps to take that can appeal to some part of his coalition.
He's gotten a lot of criticism for not showing leadership in the current budget talks, but if you compare it with the Clinton administration, you kind of understand why he's hanging back. In 1995, a lot of people forget this, the government shut down when Bill Clinton vetoed legislation. He was able to win that argument because the Republicans were divided, and he was really good at selling his point of view. With President Obama, if the government shuts down, it will be because a bill never got to his desk in the first place. And that makes it easier for him not to be tainted by the blame of the government shutdown. If I were working in the White House, I'd say, hey, cool.
Do you think the American people will really get that, in the sense that they're already kind of pointing fingers at him and worried that he's not leading? Do you think that they'll blame him?
Well, I think at that point, you're going to see a concerted effort to blame the Republicans. And if it's anything like 1995, 96, some of the Republicans will be saying, hey, let's shut down the government. That's a good thing. And they'll be kind of off message. And I think that's what they're counting on.
What struck me about the State of the Union was that rhetorically it sounded quite ambitious. But that most of what he was talking about, I think, was well out into the future, at a time when unemployment rate's at 9% and there are lots of immediate problems that people are feeling. That the call to action was not a call to action to kind of get the economy off the mat right now. It was to put money into things that over time will keep the economy in good shape once it's in good shape. And I think that has been. I mean, I think he genuinely believes that that's an important thing to do. And one of the aspects of President Obama's leadership style is this kind of patience and willingness to take a much longer view. But as a politician, that is a risky proposition, and particularly in a time when people are as unhappy as they have been about the state of things.
What happened with government reorganization?
I don't think that's a big, I know Al Gore got some mileage out of it.
No, the president mentioned that in the State of the Union. It was but I haven't heard of
Well,
since.
I don't think there's a lot of substance to it. I don't think there's a great deal of commitment to it. But if you are coming off an election in which people have expressed dissatisfaction with the size and scope of government, if you suggest that you're going to try to do something about the way government is put together and make it more streamlined and more efficient, you're trying to gain some political mileage out of that. But I don't think there's much there.
I did a search, and the first president to play that card was James Madison. Serious.
I think Claudia's right, though. I mean, this is about ideas that aren't going to cost a lot of money, right? And so, whether it's education and reorganizing the deck chairs or a massive reorganization of the government, I think that's a really good point.
And that is presumably why he talked in the State of the Union about things that are far off into the future. I mean, by 2035, 80% of energy from clean energy, things like that. Those are free for now, right? You don't have to actually do anything that costs anything if it's a 25-year goal.
Well, they would argue that modest investments at this point pay a big dividend down the line, and that if you wait to do it, it's going to be more costly, and it will take much longer to do it. So, that's a argument that they can probably legitimately make, but it is asking people to wait a long time for some of these things to come about. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about President Obama, I mean, if you think about him in comparison to Ronald Reagan, and recall that in the campaign, partly I think to get under Bill Clinton's skin, he talked about Reagan as a transformative president, and as he said, unlike Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton. But if you think about Ronald Reagan after 2 years in office, you knew what Ronald Reagan was about and what he stood for. I mean, cutting taxes, trying to shrink the power of the federal government, if not the actual size of the federal government, push power out of Washington, and confront the Soviet Union. As you said, if you were asking people to define what are the kind of core convictions of President Obama, I think it's much harder. When he's accused of being a big government liberal, he says, no, I'm not a big government liberal. And when he's accused or praised for moving to the center after the election, he said, I haven't moved to the center. So the question is, well, where does he think he is, and how does he define that? Well, how does he define his perception of government and the role of government, and his approach to the world, other than kind of more multilateralism? So I think this question of the definition of Barack Obama remains something of a mystery 2 years into his presidency.
And do you think that's a mystery because of, and I'd be curious what everybody thinks about it, because of his failure to communicate that? Is he just he's clearly a smart guy who may have very complex beliefs that are difficult to define in a very short stanza? Why is there the difficulty to define him? Is it just, again, a failure of PR, or is it that he's hard to define?
I don't think it's a failure of PR. I always thought that during the campaign, there was a kind of a contradiction in the message, which is to say, part of what attracted people to Barack Obama as a candidate was this sense of a post-partisan politics. And that brought people from across the political spectrum. He offered the promise of moving beyond these long, difficult debates that we've been having since Vietnam on one issue or another, whether it's foreign policy or culture wars or role of government. He suggested that he had a way, or would lead the country to a better place in dealing with those. At the same time, his agenda, particularly his domestic agenda, was a pretty liberal big government agenda. He wouldn't have described it that way, but the kind of health care plan he was talking about, even without an individual mandate, was a big comprehensive health care plan. And he clearly believes in an activist role for government. In a campaign, you never have to square that circle. I mean, in a campaign, your goal is to find a set of messages that appeal broadly enough that you can get a coalition to win the election. When you come into office, I think those two messages in particular created a real clash. And it was, I think, exacerbated by the fact that the country, instantly repolarized, or probably was more polarized at the time of his election than any of us were smart enough to recognize. Some people were, who I've talked to since, who said you weren't looking at the data very closely. But so I think that once he got into office, that kind of fell apart, and so it's been hard for him to reassemble that in a coherent way for people to grasp onto. And it's why there's disappointment on the left and disappointment and not disappointment, deep dislike on the right.
Fury.
Yeah.
No, it was a very polarizing decade when you think about it. It started with the tie of 2000, which ended up with Bush getting the presidency and Gore having a few more popular votes. And then, of course, there was 9/11, which brought the country together in a unique way in my lifetime, but then it quickly fell apart with the extremely divisive Iraq venture. Of course, a lot more people were for it at the time than a few months afterwards. Of course, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden were among those who supported it. But certainly, by the time Bush's second term was over, the country had a great desire for a change. And Barack Obama, in addition to being the Democrat, the alternative, the non-Bush, had this very attractive sort of grace about him, sort of bodily grace, fluency, eloquence, it seemed. And I think there was a deep desire in many people to see him as a racial healer. The single sentence that probably had the most impact in his political career was that we're not the red states or the blue states, we're the United States, in that speech at the Democratic Convention that brought him to national attention. And I think part of the disappointment with him comes from the fact that it's a return to that polarization that for a moment we thought we were going to get away from at the time of his election.
Jack, I'm curious if you, political scientists sometimes are known to say that it's the elites who are polarized, not as much the voters. I'm curious, do you agree with this increasing polarization idea?
You haven't had a real shift that much to the left or the right in the electorate. What you have is a sorting out. That is, even during the Reagan years, you had a fairly substantial number of moderate to conservative Democrats in the electorate, and even still some relatively liberal Republicans in the electorate. And that has pretty much ended. Most people are where they're supposed to be now. If you're a conservative, you're probably a Republican. If you're a liberal, you're a Democrat. And I think we see here in California that playing out in primaries.
I'm going to go back to the agenda for the president over the next year, whatever it is. I guess it's No Child Left Behind, whatever else you can figure out that's free. Is there, and Jack, I'll ask you since you worked for congressional Republicans, is there any, or I'll ask you first and then everybody else jump in, is there an incentive for congressional Republicans to play along, work with him, whatever phrase you want to use, to actually do anything, or is there an incentive to not do anything?
There's an incentive to cooperate with the president on certain issues. On some issues of trade and foreign policy, the president may find more support among the Republicans than among Democrats. And part of that is just a matter of ideology. Again, drawing a comparison to the 1990s, there came a point where Republicans saw that it was in their interest to collaborate with Bill Clinton on things such as welfare reform. I don't know if we're at that point yet, but if we're on a similar trajectory, that could happen.
Dan, or Ann, do you want to get in? Or Dan, I'm curious if you think the Republicans will what their role will be.
Yeah, I just was going to say one example, which is I do think 96 in the Clinton term is a really interesting time where the Republicans were able to work with a president who really wanted to, win the midterm, to a second term. And so not only did he get welfare reform, you get immigration, immigration reform. You also get some of the criminal defense issues that people find really challenging. So there's a lot of kind of moving to the right for that president. I think similarly this year, you are going to see some feedback from this president. So already just in the last week, we saw this issue of the healthcare waivers. Now, many people might not understand what this is, but let me just say a few words about it. What has happened is after the Affordable Care Act passed, as we know, there's been these litigation in courts challenging the individual mandate. That's still bubbling up through the court system, but many people say the state should have a lot more flexibility to decide how to actually make health reform work. And so the president has stepped back a little bit from his health reform bill and said, okay, if you're challenging and you think you have a better idea, then I'm going to say I'll support a bill in Congress to allow states to do something different in 2014 rather than waiting to 2017, or 2019, which was what was in the original bill. So I think that you may see more of this responsiveness to Republican ideas in a way that you might not in a different year.
I think we are in a period of, and I can't tell you how many months, of testing one side against the other. And I think there's probably a desire on the part of the White House to work some deals with the Republicans. And I think on some of the leadership of the Republican Party, they don't want to make the mistake that they feel was made after 1994 in kind of charging ahead too fast. I think a couple of things will come into play. One is John Boehner's not fully in charge of the House. I mean, he's got a Tea Party group of freshmen who are rebellious and rambunctious, and he's not going to be able to simply tell them this is what we are going to do. I mean, the grassroots of the Republican Party is in rebellion against Washington, and they expect the Republican Party today to act differently than the Republicans acted when they last held power in Congress, and so that complicates things. I think for the time being, we're in a kabuki dance over spending cuts, and at some point, one side or the other will conclude that their position is creating political problems for them, and they will be the first to move. And I don't know whether that's going to be the White House or the Republicans in Congress, but ultimately, if there are these clashes, we're in a week when the current continuing resolution runs out. There will have to be probably another short-term resolution passed. Then there will have to be a deal to get us through the rest of this fiscal year, and then they turn to a much bigger problem, which is the next year's budget, and then they've still got entitlements to deal with. I mean, there are a whole series of tests that are coming over the months, and I think both sides came in with the idea that that they were going to try to hold the line as long as they could on their position, and public opinion will begin to dictate. There was after the election, I did a piece about President Obama, should he be Bill Clinton or Harry Truman, which is to say, should he do what Clinton did, which was to triangulate, or do what Harry Truman did, which was really kind of take on the Congress and run against them in 1948. After I wrote that piece, the son of James Rowe, who was an advisor to Truman, sent me an email, and he said, have you ever read the memo that my father wrote to Truman in 1940, after the 1946 election? I said, no, I'd never heard of it. I knew that his father had been involved in the famous Clark Clifford memo about how to get reelected in 1948. But he wrote a memo, and he said, and it was a very dense and detailed and smart memo, but he said the single power that the president has is the power of the bully pulpit and the power of public opinion. And it is inevitable that a president with an opposition Congress is going to be in a series of confrontations and clashes. And the key for the president is to lead the country only as fast as the country is prepared to go along. And I thought, boy, that was so smart and wise. And Truman obviously adopted that with the idea of keeping the country with him while going after the Congress. I don't quite know how the president is going to do that, but they are clearly attuned to different parts of the electorate as they begin to figure out how to do these battles.
He's been sort of oddly unsuccessful at using the bully pulpit, though, hasn't he? Again, for a guy whose campaign was so rhetorically inspiring.
There have been a few rhetorical high points that stand out. I think we'd probably all agree that the Tucson speech was very successful. I also admired the Nobel Prize acceptance, which was really the only time I have heard Barack Obama convincingly formulate a sort of a positive view of the role of the United States in the world in the last 50 years. And he did it effectively there. I don't know who wrote the speech, and I don't know if it was really his personal sentiment, but he said it very effectively. But I still think it's not essentially a bully pulpit problem. This giant fact of the fiscal situation, you know, we borrow 40 cents on every dollar, and we print money. And this leads someplace very bad. And the Republicans who were so mobilized last November gave high priority to this issue, and President Obama has not given it high priority. He discussed it a little bit in his State of the Union address as something that sometime in the future is going to need to be addressed, but he still shows no sign of willingness to address it. And that's the issue I'm following, that I'm curious to see what becomes of that in the coming year. I think it will be a terrible failure of leadership if the Obama position seems to be $1 trillion plus deficits as far as the eye can see are fine, are not a problem.
I think it's interesting, in the State of the Union, he did make a pretty serious commitment that there was going to be no increases in domestic discretionary spending other than education. And so I think he is trying to send a message that this is something he cares about. You know, I still contend that he's not getting through, that people aren't hearing that. So, you know, maybe that's not enough for people. Maybe what you're saying is that's not enough, and that they're worried about these other looming bills to come down the road in terms of health reform and others.
Right, the entitlements.
And entitlements, yeah.
And let me throw another log into the fire here. A lot of the fate of the administration will depend on things that haven't happened yet, and perhaps we're not even thinking of. We've gotten some hint of that in recent weeks with Libya and the unfolding events in Japan, and we'll wake up tomorrow and something new has happened there. So the guide to the White House consists not of watching old episodes of The West Wing, where, you know, whenever Martin
it's such
Sheen,
a good show.
Yeah, well, whenever Martin Sheen got into a problem, Rob Lowe would think of a clever line, and that would be that. Whereas Charlie Sheen is the one with the communications problem. But but one book essential in understanding the fate of presidents is the book of Ecclesiastes. Time and chance happeneth to them all.
Well, I was reading today, looking at Bill Galston, who's works for Brookings Institute and writes about these things, pointed out that in the last 2 weeks, because of the Libyan situation and the fact that gas prices are going up, that I guess 2 weeks ago, that 40% of the American public thought that things were going to get better in terms of the economy. And then 2 weeks later, after Libya and after the gas prices started going up, only 29% of the American people are thinking that the economy is going to get better. So I do think that there's so many moving parts, and people are really insecure about how this is going to resolve itself.
And it was no surprise that when the president had his press conference on Friday, they announced it on Thursday and announced that he would have an opening statement about gas prices, and he devoted 5 or 8 minutes at the top of the press conference to gas prices for exactly that reason.
Well, I want to talk about foreign policy briefly, and then maybe a little bit about 2012, but let me ask the audience at this point, if you have questions written on cards, pass them down to the end of the aisle. There are some folks who will come around and collect them and bring them down, and they'll be brought up to me. So go ahead and pass them down to the end of the aisle or write out the question quickly, and we'll get to those. But while they're collecting the cards, let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. This is a presidency that at the start I thought, or leading up to the 2008 election, might be chiefly consumed with foreign policy. That is to say, extricating the country from the unpopular situation in Iraq. The president ran on a surge in Afghanistan. All of that has sort of seems to have gone by the wayside as the economy has dominated the public mind. Does anybody think that foreign policy is at the root of Barack Obama's problems? Is there a way that, short of a rally around the flag incident, which we don't want to happen, is there some way that some foreign policy achievement would give him a boost? Is there much of importance that will happen in foreign policy in terms of the president's popularity, or that has happened?
I think it's been surprising the degree to which foreign policy has sort of slipped off the public conversation.
Yeah.
Now, you could say, well, that's obvious because, unemployment has been above 9% for almost 2 years, and everything else does fall by the wayside in a time of economic crisis. But I mean, he has kept his promise to end the war in Iraq, but he has dramatically escalated the war in Afghanistan, and there is a lot of unhappiness with that war. It hasn't become a voting issue at this point, but if you look at the polling on the war, the percentage of people who think the war in Afghanistan has been a mistake is at levels that rival those of Iraq in the depths of Bush's problems on Iraq. It just doesn't happen to be a critical problem. There's any of these foreign policy problems could become a serious political problem for President Obama, particularly if the economy begins to get a little better. If something blows up around the world, he could pay a price for it.
Certainly, foreign policy success would help him, but the one we have on the front pages at the moment, the foreign policy situation, I don't think, whatever your political views, the president's handling of Libya can have enhanced your confidence in him. His public statements have repeatedly suggested that Gaddafi must go, but that he has willed that end without willing the means. He's
what could he have done? No-fly zone? That's about it, right?
Well, there are all kinds of things a president could do. He could have signaled through back channels that there would be a price to pay if Libyan planes flew, and just leave them wondering what it would be, and remembering when the United States bombed Libya after one of the terrorist episodes in the 80s. I think a decision to stay out would be accepted by the American public, which is in many instances rather isolationist. But that's not the position the president has staked out. He said Gaddafi must go without willing the means, holding a lot of meetings. And it seems to me his Secretary Clinton's statements have been even more assertive than the president's, but again, not backed up by actions that match the words. I think anybody who's followed this issue closely cannot have been reassured about the president's strength as a leader.
Jack, I'm curious, if you compared to past presidents, are presidents ever really judged on foreign policy other than in a rally around the flag sort of moment?
Yeah, the foreign policy comes into play when American lives or interests are very directly at stake, which is why the Iranian Revolution was such a disaster for Carter, because it was a triple whammy. You had, in the first instance, the oil shock. Then you had the Iranian hostage crisis, and then as a result of the oil shock, you had the recession of 1980. So he got hit in 3 waves as a result of the Iranian Revolution. partial defense of Obama, one could speculate that perhaps things are going on behind the scenes. Perhaps the Arab League endorsement of a no-fly zone may reflect secret diplomacy. But that's if you're president, that's the frustrating thing about secret diplomacy. It has to stay secret. You can't go out, hey, guess what? I secretly negotiated it. You can't do that. But that's pure speculation, and we won't know for many years until the files are declassified.
Unless they go on WikiLeaks.
Yes.
Well, they're declassified by WikiLeaks. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit, before we do some questions here, let's talk a little bit about 2012. Jack, you said earlier you thought that it was more likely than not that Obama would be reelected, which was a little surprising to me. I mean, you think that even if the economy wallows along, the perception of the economy continues to be poor, the power of incumbency is enough to carry him forward through 2012?
Well, a couple of things are working in Obama's favor. The economy isn't great, but it's better than it was. And that works to his benefit. The other thing that works to his advantage is James Madison.
Not James Madison again.
Yes, I'm not always thinking of James Madison. We have a Republican Congress. We have a Republican House of Representatives, and probably we'll have a Republican Senate after the next election. And there are at least some Americans, not a majority, but some, who take divided government into account, who like the idea of checks and balances. So 1996, Republicans in Congress ran against Bill Clinton, the famous crystal ball ad that the RNC ran. Suppose Bill Clinton's reelected. We need a Republican Congress to check him. Bob Dole was not very fond of that ad. And Barack Obama was able to run against Dole Gingrich. One word, Dole Gingrich. And so it's possible that Barack Obama could run as a check on the Republican House, just as Republican House members are running as a check against Barack Obama.
I'm curious, other people's sort of analysis of 2012. Anne, is it reliant on the economy?
I mean, I think that, typically the economy is what drives voters. I think that the biggest advantage Obama has right now is that there's not a clear Republican opponent. I think if somebody emerges from this field who shows him or herself to be a serious contender, that Obama will have something to worry about. But right now, I don't follow this closely enough to, in my, what I've followed, it doesn't seem like there's a clear contender right now. But Dan, you follow this much more closely than me.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, this is a unique Republican race in that there is not an heir apparent in the way that there have been in most Republican races in the past. If there is a nominal front runner, it's Mitt Romney, but he has a lot of questions that he's got to answer, beginning with his health care plan that bears striking resemblance to the Obama health care plan. But the process of becoming the nominee of a political party is an enhancing process in the eyes of the public, and whoever becomes the nominee will have gone through probably a pretty serious battle within the Republican Party, and if you survive that, you're going to stand on the stage in Tampa and accept that nomination and probably be a formidable candidate. Judging from the way the Obama team is gearing up, they are clearly anticipating that this is not going to be an easy election. They may in fact be one of the first formal candidacies on either side, which is astonishing. But by this time next month, there's likely to be an Obama re-election committee filed and raising money and doing things. The electoral map could be difficult for them. One of the things about the Obama team in 2008, which was I think helpful to them in the long run, was that they were determined not to let the 2000 election come down to having to win Ohio or Florida, and they figured out multiple routes to get to 270 electoral votes. Obviously, they had a significant cushion by the time they got there because they won a lot of the states that Democrats hadn't won in a long time. But you would have to say that North Carolina is going to be more difficult this time than it was in 2008, that Virginia could be more difficult, that Indiana certainly will be more difficult, and that Ohio could well be more difficult given the state of the economy. We don't know about Wisconsin, which is blowing itself up politically right now, and in a very, I think, in ways that have potential national significance. But Pennsylvania could be a tough state. The demographics of Pennsylvania are not great for Barack Obama. So the electoral map is tough. They know they've also got to re-engage with the base that they had in 2008, which has drifted away, which has become more disenchanted. Some of the things that they've done in the last 2 or 3 months, particularly Don't Ask, Don't Tell, have begun to re-energize some people on the left, but probably not enough. Young people are potentially another big problem that they've got to deal with, and they are systematically going about that. One of my colleagues, Peter Walston, had a very good story on our front page today about the efforts that they're already at work at on college campuses to try to re-engage with young voters to try to get them enthusiastic again about coming out in 2012. So, it obviously is impossible at this point to know how things are going to unfold, but they are not anticipating an easy re-election by any means.
And why, you mentioned something that struck me was that you mentioned the slowness of the Republican field to formulate and the fact that they could be the first candidate, which would be unusual. Well, why is that? Why is the Republican field
there are a couple of reasons. The first reason is that the calendar is supposed to be a month later than it was last time. I mean, last time we had this incredibly early start. I mean, all of us spent New Year's Eve in Des Moines, Iowa, if you can believe that. And I don't recommend that for your New Year's Eves. But the two national committees have established that the first early primaries, Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, would be held in February of 2012. And then Super Tuesday couldn't happen until March rather than early February. Now, that gave everybody a little bit more of a cushion, so they didn't feel they had to get in right away. Unfortunately for them, this calendar may well get moved back or moved forward to where it was the last time around, so they're going to be a month short. I think another thing that has happened is that the field is so unsettled. There are some potentially significant candidates that we just don't have any idea whether they're really going to get in. Sarah Palin being the most obvious. If she gets in, she occupies a lot of space. I'm not going to speculate on whether she has a real chance or not have a real chance, but there's no question that she is a big figure within the Republican Party. If you are a candidate or a potential candidate, it would be helpful to you if you sort of knew what she was going to do. Mike Huckabee, who won Iowa last time and who is the leader in many of the national polls, albeit with a very small margin, says he's seriously thinking about it, but people aren't convinced that he's really seriously going to get into it. But if he does, that changes the dynamic. And I think the third reason is that Mitt Romney, who, as I say, is the nominal front runner, is just biding his time. And because he hasn't gotten in, I think others feel they don't have to rush in because they're not falling that far behind. Now, behind the scenes, Romney is doing a lot to nail down a lot of money and put together his network so that when he finally does come out, he'll have a pretty robust operation. But for all of those reasons, I think it's been much slower.
Let's work in some of the questions from the audience here because we have a number of them on 2012. One of them is, will health care reform, the signature achievement so far of the Obama administration, even matter very much? Was that, by the time we get to the 2012 election, does the health care bill make much of a difference? Whichever one of you wants to go first. Go ahead, Claudia.
What I was going to say is, if a governor is the Republican candidate, he'll probably talk about it a lot, because the governors are really on the front lines of trying to make this work and finding it extremely hard. And the Republican governors in particular have got a lot of problems with the health care reform.
Unless it's Governor Romney, whose plan bears a family resemblance to the Obama plan.
And has a lot of problems.
Very much agree with both of those statements. The only thing I would add is that I think it will be smart of Obama to kind of figure out how you make this a positive story. So in the same way that he used Lilly Ledbetter and the issue of fair pay and really got the women engaged in his campaign, in 2008, I think he's going to need to find some stories of, for example, parents who have children with pre-existing condition who now are able to get health care, young people who were left without health care who could get back on their parents' plan. So you're going to probably see a lot of these faces in his advertisements, a lot more talking about, I think he's going to try to solve some of his communication problems to let people feel tangibly what this health reform bill has meant. Whether that works, I don't know, but I think you'll see it.
Is there another question? Is what major policy change or initiative would you advise Obama to undertake to improve his re-election chances? Is there something that he can do, or are we back to the problem that there's no money to spend, so he can only do things that are free, and therefore it's hard to know what he could do?
Well, I'm going to sound like a Johnny One Note, but if I were Obama, I would say, yes, Republicans, let's do it. Let's be the people who took on this entitlement problem and seriously try to come to a joint agreement. That would be a coup.
And you think the Republicans would be willing to step off the cliff, as Dan put it earlier?
If it were, it's possible. They might see this as
optimistic of you, Claudia.
They might see it as too threatening, because I think it would help Obama win.
But it really is a cliff, because if you ask most people, should we reform entitlements? Sure, just don't touch Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah, the polls are very strong that people want the Social Security and Medicare, and they'd be even willing to have their payroll tax increase to keep it. And so it's a dangerous issue with regard to the voters, I think.
But in thinking about this session this evening, I kept coming back to a phrase that I think Tony Blankley used in a column. He said there's a great hunger for a reality-based politics. This is a real problem, and there are real consequences for our country if our currency becomes worthless, if we become, a superpower-sized Greece. And I think enough American voters appreciate that there is the possibility of real credit to the person who leads. We like it when presidents lead effectively. And I think that would be a coup. I think he would secure re-election if he did that.
You're very optimistic about voters. Here's a question about another issue which came up only very, very briefly. Will the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell help or hurt the president's chances of re-election? Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I think in a narrow sense, it's...
Or perhaps a third option is it'll make no difference.
It probably will not make that much difference. I mean, that would be my guess. And where it will certainly make some difference, I think, is in fundraising for the president on the left, and particularly within the gay and lesbian community. I mean, I think if you talk to the White House people or Obama political people, they would acknowledge that has been quite helpful in, pulling together a constituency that has been quite disenchanted with his lack of leadership on some of those issues.
Does it hurt? Does anybody think it hurts? Or are the people who are going to be angered are not going to vote for him anyway?
I don't see it changing many votes.
Okay. Public opinion is moving on that, on those issues pretty dramatically.
A question which we talked a little bit about earlier, did Obama sincerely reach out to Republicans? Curious what you think. I think part of the answer is that in the first year he did not. That is to say, they decided to achieve the health care bill without Republican support.
Right.
So I'll add an addendum to the question, was that a mistake? And this goes back to a little bit about what we started talking about at the beginning. But Ann, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, Dan talked about the fact that there was this idea that they were going to pass health reform by Labor Day, and it obviously went well past that. And I think part of it is that they actually spent an extraordinary amount of time trying to reach out to Republicans. You'll remember that in the Senate Finance Committee, there was this idea that they shouldn't get a bill out of the Senate Finance Committee unless it was a bipartisan bill. So they spent a lot of time trying trying to work with Grassley and with Senator Snowe from Maine and others to try to get them to vote for it. Senator Snowe ultimately did vote, a Republican from Maine ultimately did vote for the bill coming out of the Senate Finance Committee, but then wasn't willing to continue her support onto the floor, said that she felt like it was being rushed, it was too much, too fast. And I think in some sense you could argue that they wasted a lot of time by trying to be bipartisan because it didn't ultimately work.
Although on the stimulus, they might have been able to buy off some of the Republicans on that. And that would have changed the politics of that issue dramatically.
You think they should have done that?
From a policy standpoint, no, but from a political standpoint, it would have made sense.
I think that the Republicans were pretty kind of dug in that they didn't want to give any wins. And so there was, across the board, not voting for their stimulus, not voting for the health reform. You can imagine those who could have supported it, as Jack said, and just were unwilling to politically rather than substantively.
There are a couple of questions, maybe we'll finish with these. There are a couple of questions about sort of who Obama is, I guess, and maybe this goes back to Dan's point about that it's hard to define Obama. But one is, compared to Reagan and Clinton, doesn't Obama fail to have a visceral connection to Middle America, and if so, why?
Because he's not Middle America. He's Harvard Law and University of Chicago and community organizing and Hyde Park.
But let me play devil's advocate. George Bush was Harvard Law and Harvard Business School and kind of Bunkport, but nobody said he failed to connect with Middle America.
True, but he
affected a Texas accent.
No, he had a Texas accent. He was from Texas. It was his father who moved to Texas. No, he connects better with ordinary people, whereas Barack Obama always, after his community organizing days, always moved in elite circles.
One thing that probably would have done Barack Obama a world of good at some point in his political career would have been losing to a Republican. For instance, a formative experience of Bill Clinton's career was losing the governorship of Arkansas and coming back. Barack Obama never had to do that. You could argue he's never, to this day, had a truly competitive race against a Republican. If you look back at his initial election to the U.S. Senate in 2004, it's almost as if he was chosen by God, given the events that happened in that campaign, some of which included 7 of 9 from Star Trek Voyager. This gets into some salacious details of that campaign. But he never, he ran in a heavily Democratic district. He did lose, but it was a Democratic primary to Bobby Rush. He did have a difficult time in the Democratic primaries, but again, that was within the party. So he never had that really formative educational experience of losing to a Republican and having to come back that Bill Clinton had, and that did him an enormous amount of good in the decades to follow.
Could I just offer an impression?
Yeah.
Now, I can't prove this, but I've been kind of intrigued at how often both Barack and Michelle Obama mention their respect for military families. And I think that they have been exposed to military families for the first time in their lives and have felt a genuine respect for them. The president visits wounded soldiers and visits them on the front lines, and I think this is clearly a new experience for them, and they emphasize this so often that maybe I'm a sucker, but I think I'm persuaded that they really have learned something about a slice of America that they didn't know about before, a slice of sort of middle America.
Dan, do you want to take a crack at this? You travel around, cover politics all over. Does he connect with average people? He sure did in 2008, but...
Yeah, I mean, he did connect with people, but there's a part of America that he didn't connect with, and we saw that in the primaries against Hillary Clinton. in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania. I mean, white blue-collar workers, he had a great deal of difficulty making that connection. People who were suffering economically. I mean, the comparison between Barack Obama and Bill Clinton out feeling somebody's pain is just, night and day. And it has been a mystery to me. I've thought a lot about it because, I know some people, put down the community organizing thing, but the reality of what he was doing as a community organizer was dealing directly with people who were in economic distress. I mean, people whose lives had been totally upended by the closing of steel mills in the south side of Chicago. And yet you never saw as a candidate that kind of pure empathy when he was confronted by somebody in pain on the campaign trail that you would have expected from someone who had gone through those kinds of experiences as a younger person and a community organizer. I don't know the answer to it. It's certainly there. It's certainly real. I think it's a persistent problem, and I think he's worked to try to solve it, but I don't think he's yet solved it.
It's a hard thing to know how you work to try to solve, right? If you're
yeah, I mean, part of it
practice.
is you either have it or you don't.
Yeah.
I mean, and people recognize that. I mean, it's we all are what we are, and,
right.
and you can't fundamentally change that. But as I say, I've been somewhat surprised through the course of 2007, 2008, and then particularly with the economy in the kind of shape it was by the time he became president, that this has remained a problem for him, and could be a problem in 2012. I mean, if you look at the numbers on his support among white non-college voters, or Democrats have not done particularly well with that constituency in some recent years, but he's got a more acute problem than some other Democrats have had.
Is another question, similar, I guess, going to who he is. Is Obama a liberal at heart or a pragmatist like Bill Clinton? Anne, do you want to?
Well, I
somebody
think
worked for the Clintons. Do you want to?
Yeah. Well, I think it's so fascinating. So, I was obviously on the other side of on the primary. I was for Hillary Clinton, having worked for her, and I was so surprised at the left's kind of love for Barack Obama. And the reason I say that is that the policy differences between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were very minimal. In fact, the only one that I can think of is that Barack Obama didn't want an individual mandate in the health reform bill. And so it was really fascinating to me that there was the left kind of painted him as this really liberal savior of the Democratic Party, someone who was going to save them from what Clinton had done. When in fact, I think that he was very similar in terms of policy, in terms of being a pragmatist, in terms of being a centrist, in terms of working with Republicans. And I think that's proven true in his presidency. So I think at heart he is a pragmatist. I think he does have a vision of government like Bill Clinton did, which is that there is a very important role for government in our society of having a safety net. He doesn't, he's not a conservative, but he's no bleeding heart liberal, I would say.
Jack, do you want to, curious what you think on that?
Well, I think if Bill Clinton had been the senator from Illinois instead of the governor of Arkansas, his voting record would have, his positions would have been much to the left of what they were. I think both of these presidents are responsive to their political opportunities. I think if you look at what Obama said over the years, I think his inclinations are definitely on the liberal side, but as a state legislator, you've got to do business, and he was a state legislator for many years.
Did you want to do, okay. And then one last question, which just is kind of curious to me. Is the president too contemplative? Is he too thoughtful for the political world? And you're nodding your head yes.
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking, so I work in the law school. Chris Edley is our dean, and he was Barack Obama's professor in law school. And so there's this story that's been written about in the press, so I'm not sharing secrets from the law school. But Dean Edley talks about the fact that during the campaign, he went to Chicago and basically said to the campaign staff, you're not giving Barack Obama enough time to think, that he, in his pure nature as a contemplative person, and really needs the space and time to be able to think and reflect, and that's how he becomes his best. And I think there is really something to that. He's very different than Bill Clinton. Having worked from Bill Clinton, Bill Clinton is a political animal and certainly was an intellect and was very smart, but he never wanted anyone to know that. Whereas Barack Obama, I think, really, in some sense, shines at this professorial role and this contemplative role. So I think he is.
Is that a problem?
I think it has proved to be a little bit of a problem. I mean, I do think it is this idea that you don't necessarily feel like he is feeling your pain, or that he is, connecting with you. And I think that that does, cause some challenges.
Well, and in handling certain issues, it's a problem. I think it's been a problem for him on Libya. There is a tide in the affairs of men, and if I don't know if any cities fell to Gaddafi today, but they're not waiting for us to make a committee decision. And he's, as I read his performance in this unforeseen crisis or episode, he's unable to act in a timely manner.
Jack?
I think Barack Obama would be a wonderful dean of faculty. But as as you said, the contemplative qualities have both benefits and costs. We want presidents to be deliberative, but there also comes a time when you have to put the hammer down.
I want to read something from the interview that we did with Obama in 2008 when we asked him about Lincoln and governing style, because it bears on this point of kind of how he sees himself and in some ways the kind of the deliberativeness of his approach. He talked about how Lincoln's his favorite president for a lot of reasons, but he said one of the things he admired most in Lincoln was that there was a, quote, deep-rooted honesty and empathy to the man that allowed him to always be able to see the other person's point of view and always sought to find the truth, that the truth is in the gap between you and me. The truth is out there somewhere. He said, I don't fully possess it, you don't fully possess it, and it's our job to listen and learn and imagine enough to be able to get to that truth. He said, if you look at Lincoln's presidency, he never lost that. Most of our other great presidents, there was the sense of working the angles and bending other people to their will. He said, FDR being the classic example. Lincoln just found a way to shape public opinion and shape people around him and lead them and guide them without tricking them or bullying them, but just through the force of what I talked about, the way of helping to illuminate the truth. He said, I find that a very compelling style of leadership. It's not one that I've mastered, but I think that's when leadership is at its best. And I think if you think about the way Obama has approached things, that is revelatory in understanding why he sometimes operates the way he does.
Okay, on that thoughtful note, and I think Abe Lincoln trumps James Madison, maybe, I'm not sure. But anyway, on that thoughtful note, I think we'll stop. We'll come back next year. My thanks to the panel, Claudia Anderson, Jack Pitney, Ann O'Leary, Dan Balz. Thank you. Good night.